They were looking at Bergson's Creative Evolution, Chapter 2, in which Bergson gives an evolutionary account of life, but also of the emergence of the intellect. And he tracks this evolution from the practical use of intelligence, which he calls fabrication, the engagement of the intellect with matter, all the way to geometry, which is abstract and goes beyond matter. And he sees this evolution as a series of necessities, not as a kind of creative concrescence, so much as the finality or the fatalist march that is, in a way, determinate and a determinism that follows from the fact that we strive for the finite. We strive to cognize a fully determinate state, rather than seeing the intellect and life as a living activity, which motivates and endures throughout the transformations that thinking brings about. For Bergson, thought is derivative from a living activity. Thought passes from a living flux to a state of a system, something that can be described, that is general, that is finite, and is derivative from the original flow of life that it's pulled from. I'm going to discuss this by following a thread of ideas that Bergson puts in italics in Chapter 2 of Creative Evolution, where he attempts to explain or draw out the essence of the intellect, as he says, and to make it clear what the intellect is, how it emerges from the movement of life, and why it is a dissociation, we could say, why it is a narrowing of consciousness and a narrowing of life into a single path, one that is, of course, useful and gives us a sketch of the way that things work in the world, which is extremely useful and practical, but which does not actually give us the nature of life, and that is completely ill-suited to understanding life. And in this way, he shows how evolutionarily why life has reached the point where it has reached today, where we cannot understand the reality of life and the phenomena of evolution. I'm also going to draw on a lecture that Bergson gave that is published in his book Mind Energy, called The Soul and the Body. And in this text, he describes the intellect and our way of understanding it, and does so through a series of images, of metaphorical explanation of the way it works. And this really outlines the multiple ways of knowing, on the one hand, the intelligence and how it works and what it does in order to derive the knowledge that it can produce, and intuitive knowledge that can make use of experience and scientific examples, as well as metaphor. But it uses all of these things to go beyond them and to reinstate ourselves in the living duration of our life, and to use that evidence, the self-evidence of our own living consciousness, to understand how the mind works and to understand ultimately life and evolution. The chapter starts by showing the source of divergence, differentiation within life, which is not teleological in the normal sense, nor is it mechanical, but rather it must be understood as psychological in nature, and that the complex dynamics of the personality, which is something more than the personal identity or self-image of a person, the personality is something that involves the whole past, every unique detail of our past, and is really the structured linking of meaningful relations between the moments of our past, rather than the collection of those moments. The way that we make relevant relations among a multiplicity of memories and habits, that is our character, but more importantly, because character is generalizable, we often compare one person's character with another one, character traits, that kind of thing. Those are general. But more importantly, this interconnected relevance of our memories and habits is something singular, idiosyncratic, something personal. And it is this personal, singular character which is the source of life's creativity and freedom. So all life, in a way, is carrying in it the virtual power, the virtual potential to become personal, but the élan vital is what we could call pre-personal consciousness. It is anti-anthropomorphic view of consciousness. So it's better to say that the élan vital is a scarcely conscious or even unconscious depth to our pure memory. We have the élan vital in the depths of our consciousness, scarcely, or unconsciously. Memory is a psychological connection to an ontologically primitive mode of existence. This mode of existence is called virtuality, which is defined by the reciprocal implication, which rather than existing, we could say that it subsists, or that it coexists with the actual, with the transient passage of the present moment. So the virtual and the actual, or we could say the reciprocal implication of things and the expression of them, explication and complication of them, coexist. Memory connects the pure past and its virtuality with the present and its actuality. It is a continuity making. Memory and consciousness are this passive synthesis between the virtual and the actual. This just is to say that consciousness is duration, the experience of time, the connecting of the past and the present. Personality, as we think it, is for the most part a phenomena of animality. This is not to say that plant life can or should not be understood psychologically. It should and can. It is the torpor, the sleepiness of consciousness, which is the distinguishing trait of plant psychology, although it is part of human and animal psychology as well. It is exaggerated in the plant. So it's wrong to think that because consciousness is sleeping, that it is no longer existing. This is what Bergson says in Matter and Memory, that it's a prejudice of the intellect to think that only what is present in time, the present in time, and what is presentable to the mind, representation, right? Something present and represented in the mind. Only that which is present in time and representable in the mind can exist and be conceived. It is reasonable to, of course, be skeptical about realities that we cannot examine for ourselves, that we cannot make the object of a material science. But it is also unreasonable to deny the existence of insensible realities, what cannot be represented, or furthermore, modalities of existence like subsistence, virtuality, what today Terence Deacon calls absential properties. The personality, according to Bergson, is the state of reciprocal implication, meaning that it consists of an infinity of details, right? Our past, our personality has an infinity of details, but each of those details has a unique relation to every other detail, such that the infinite multiplicity of memories and details consists not merely of an infinity of finite parts, but rather, or an infinity of pieces of information. No, rather, each part is a perspective on the infinite. It is an infinite part of the whole. The past as virtual, as Gilles Deleuze makes clear in his book Bergsonism, the past as virtual means that it is not only an infinite multiplicity of differences, but also self-differentiating, that the same multiplicity, having an infinite number of nodes within it, also has an infinite number of times which it is differentiated from itself. And as Tano Postoraro makes clear, the dynamic effect of the virtual, its self-differentiating infinity of infinities, described by Deleuze, is common to plants as well as to animals, but the case is that their psychological activity happens at a different rhythm, at a different duration than the human, and it is in some ways limited by that. To understand plant psychology, we must match its rhythm. We see this with like a time-lapse video where the vitality of the plant really becomes visible when we speed it up. So if we both speed it up, the life of the plant, and spread it out in the duration of a society of plants, we'll see that the psychological unity is between the cells, between the plants themselves as colonies. A tree, Bergson says, is actually a society a society of these branching plants, and a organismic root society as well. We can see this by the fact that we can cut branches off the tree and graft them onto another tree, even across different species, and we can propagate cuttings of the plants such that the plant becomes a whole new clone of that plant by cutting a branch off and making it put out roots at the bottom. So the society of the plants is a whole, a psychological whole, rather than the individuals. That doesn't mean it is not, each part of the plant is not sensed or integrated in the larger whole. I think it's the same as what Bergson says about bees that occurs within plants. For bees, the psychological integration occurs between or among the multiplicity of the bees. There's a multiple unity of the self in the swarm of the bees, in the whole society of bees. It's not unreasonable, I think, that we can imagine each bee communicates with every other bee and is sympathetic to what all of the other bees are perceiving through certain communication by chemicals and smells and vibration patterns and things like that. Each bee, in a way, perceives what each of the other bees is perceiving, and this is communicated through the whole system such that the swarm is not one single viewpoint, but it is all of the viewpoints in reciprocal implication, self-differentiating reciprocal implication, which is to say that they form a virtual whole, and that the durational life of the swarm is sort of awake to that whole and actualizes it in the movements of the swarm as a whole. Human consciousness is far more disintegrated than that of bees and of plants. It disintegrates consciousness from the perspective of individuals, such that individuals are less sharing in conscious states, and perhaps even in the mind of each individual with itself, because of the nature of disintegration. Now, disintegration is responsible for personality disorders and dissociative disorders, but it is also equally responsible for the use of our consciousness, the normal, average, everyday use of our consciousness in relation to life and getting around with other people and in our sociality. And this is clear because disintegration of conscious states is a necessary ingredient for both instinct and intellect. And as we'll see, intuition is neither integration nor disintegration, neither dissociation or undissociated. It is a movement that goes between the two, or we could say it is the modulation of consciousness between dissociations, or between these disintegrated planes of consciousness, reintegrating and disintegrating planes of consciousness. And again, it's the movement between them, the negotiating and creation of integrations and disintegrations. That is what expresses our consciousness, and it's what makes sense of experience in new ways. The disintegration is what allows for a derivative integration, a sub-integration, siphoned off from the whole of our duration, canalizing a portion of the infinite implicated details into a particular expression, a sense-making movement, a plane of consistency, a plane of consciousness. Disintegration and dissociation make possible the complex, concrete actions of animal life and human thought. Psychological dissociation maps the disintegration of consciousness from the pure virtual subsistence of the past. Consciousness detaches part of itself and pushes everything into the background, narrowing its focus, and this narrowing draws more out of what it contains. It draws more meaning out of it. It makes it more vivid and complicates and expresses what was implicit and latent. Dissociation enables attention. Attention gears the sensory motor habits into the concrete context in a way that is meaningful only by ignoring the right things and remaining vigilant to what is conducive to the conduct of life. If we pay attention to too many of the new variables in a situation, it won't be clear that we can use certain habits that we already have usefully in that situation. There may be affordances that we would miss if we were too attentive to the wrong details. The attention to life, as Bergson calls it, is the way of managing our dissociations to focus our living energies on what is useful and beneficial to life. It requires that we disintegrate parts of our experience, that we block them out, that we ignore them, that we suppress certain tendencies, and that we focus life, right? And this vantage of life, this focus of life, it makes happy use of instinct and intellect. They are well suited to it, especially for animals. And it also suits plant life to have the sleepy, torpid psychology that it has. It does wake up from time to time, only in a more drawn-out duration than our own, and in one that is more integrated with its ecology and populations. Now, between plant solidarity and unconscious, and animal selfishness and wakefulness, we find the whole of personality. It is what traces a continuum between the shared elan of an impersonal consciousness and the sort of, you might say, divisive, divergent expressions of personal singularity. Life, understood as the elan vital, is both of these tendencies together at once. These divergences within personality between unconscious solidarity and selfish animality. Due to the circumstances of life, to the particularities of the affordances that the earth provides, everything is a niche, right? Life is only exists within niches. And life varies its expressions with the affordances that make its shape determinate, right? They have a determinate shape, and therefore life finds power in their shape and takes on a determinate shape. The obstacle to life's expression, its integral impetus, is the very affordance by which that integral expression is disintegrated and creates a morphology and sets out on a canalized path of its morphology. The integral view of life coexists with these divergences within it, with its divergent tendencies, and with the fact that it must become divisive with itself in order to continue. But in the biophilosopher, we can see the continuity between the divergent tendencies, right? Between the integral view of life as coexisting divergence. The divergent tendencies of life, like those of one's own personality, explodes into bifurcations, and decisions are made, and selection happens, and competing commitments cannot be always simultaneously fulfilled. We have to choose a path at certain moments in life. Life has a plurality of values that can neither be consolidated or substituted, right? Our sleepiness and unconscious and our wakefulness and creativity must be held together. They're both parts of what it is to be alive and what life is. And we are each committed to instincts and habits, cognitive processes, and certain frames of reference, certain ways of making sense of the world. We have already set up ways of understanding our life and our action, and yet there are parts of our integral self, of our complete personality, that sit outside of all of our habits and ways of thinking and cognitive processes. Bergson shows that habit and pure memory are different in kind. Habit reenacts the past through repetition. Memory, on the other hand, is what cannot be repeated. The past is determined. It is already what it is. It has already happened. It's unable to change. Habit, on the other hand, is always changing. The past is unchangeable. Memory, of course, as an act of remembering, as recollecting the past, is always different. Every time we remember, we must integrate the past with the present, our psychological state as a whole, right? So it takes on the integral shape of our present existence. And it emerges from the background of our new memories and habits, everything that's happened since this moment in the past. And thus, remembering is going to be a disintegration and dissociation. On page 111, 120 in the French, Bergson formulates a law, he says, to explain this. He says, when a tendency is analyzed as it develops, each of the particular tendencies born in this way would like to preserve and develop everything in the primitive tendency that is not incompatible with the work in which it has specialized. And what Bergson is getting at here is that life makes selections. Life is forced by circumstances to preserve and develop of the primitive tendency everything that is compatible with the work it has specialized in. When life develops its morphologies, it invests itself in them. It puts everything at stake with the forms that it takes. And where it lies in the evolution of life, in the complex changes of geology that it adapts to, life is forced to specialize, and when it becomes extremely specialized, it becomes more difficult for it to regain from the primitive tendency and its reciprocal implications in larger possibility horizons. That becomes more and more difficult. On page 117, he says, as I have implied from the beginning of this book, the role of life is to insert indetermination into matter. The forms that life will create along the course of its evolution are indeterminate, by which I mean unforeseeable. And these forms serve as a vehicle for the activity that is more and more indeterminate, by which I mean more and more free. A nervous system, with its neurons placed end to end in such a way that multiple pathways open up at the extremity of each one, and where just as many questions are asked, is a genuine reservoir of indetermination. The nervous system, with its neuroplasticity, this openness of indetermination, is the conduit of the psychological power of sense-making to rearrange and restructure a multiplicity of elements in concert with each other. It is the nervous system and the sensory motor system for Bergson that makes animality and animal life open itself to new courses and new possible ways and doesn't get stuck on the course that it takes. So he says on page 124, vegetative torpor, instinct, and intelligence. These are thus the elements that coincided in the vital impetus common to plants and animals, and that, along the course of their development, through which they were manifested in the most unpredicted forms, dissociated from each other as a result of the simple fact of their growth. And by growth, he means there, of course, their particular canalization, their specialization. He then says, the major error, the one that has been passed along since Aristotle, and that has tainted the majority of philosophies of nature, is to see in plant life, in instinctual life, and in the life of reason, 3 successive degrees of a single tendency that develops, whereas they are in fact 3 diverging directions of an activity that was divided as it grew. So Aristotle in the De Anima says, De Anima means of the soul, paripsyche in Greek. His text on the soul goes into the plant soul and the animal soul and the human soul and analyzes each and shows that they are successive stages of development, just as Bergson says. And he thinks that this is the case in embryology, for example. So Aristotle thinks that at first we have a vegetative soul, the plant soul, nutritive soul, he calls it, and this begins to form our body in the developmental process. And then as we form as a unique fauna, as an individual animal, we develop our instinctual life and we form habits and all of this. So instinctual life is unique to animals, but it emerges from a plant life that makes it possible. And then finally, the life of reason emerges from both of these. So they are successive degrees of a single tendency that develops, as Bergson says. And his alternative is to say, no, instead they are diverging directions that emerges through the dissociation and the dividing up and the disintegration of the activity of life as it grows. So after outlining the divergence between animal life and plant life, he goes on to show what the intellect is and how it is another divergent direction of the elan vital, of the original impetus of life. And he cautions what is going to follow and says that basically he's going to over-exaggerate the differences between these things. He says this on page 126, 138 in the French. What follows should be taken merely as a schematic drawing in which the respective contours of intellect and instinct will be more pronounced than they should be. A drawing in which we have neglected the softening of these contours that results both from the hesitancy of each one of them and from their reciprocal encroachment on each other. When it comes to a topic this obscure, one must not spare any effort in moving toward the light. It will always be easier to blur the forms later on, to correct what might have been too geometric in the drawing. In short, to substitute the suppleness of life for the stiffness of a schema. And he traces this schema across a series of what we could call propositions, sentences that he puts in italics that are meant to be clear, formulaic representations of the essence of the intellect. This starts on page 127. And here he says that we shouldn't understand the human human intelligence in terms of wisdom, so Homo sapien, sapien meaning wisdom, the wise ape or the wise man, but rather Homo faber, or the fabricator, the maker. We should not say Homo sapien, but rather Homo faber. In fact, intellect, considered according to what appears to be its original procedure, is the faculty for fabricating artificial objects, in particular, tools for making tools, and indefinitely varying their fabrication. This basically means that the intellect is practical. You know, Bergson has this connection to pragmatism, that knowledge is, for the most part, geared towards what is practical, and therefore we shouldn't think that the mind is set up to do metaphysics, but rather to manipulate matter and to organize our practical needs, and evolves because it's useful for our ability to fabricate and create tools. On page 128, 141 in the French, he says, "We will find an essential difference between the two. Perfected instinct is a faculty for using and even of constructing organic instruments. Perfected intellect is the faculty for fabricating and for using inorganic instruments." Now on page 131, 144, he says, "Instinct and intellect thus represent two equally elegant but diverging solutions to one and the same problem. The problem is, of course, the way of getting through life, the way of managing our situation as animals." Now on page 131 to 132, Bergson italicizes the following sentence the representation is blocked by the action. Now, it's not clear that this is one of the propositions, since all the other italicized propositions, as I'm calling them, occur at the end of a paragraph. This italicized corollary, perhaps, of the preceding paragraph explains what he means by nil consciousness and nullified consciousness, which is italicized earlier in this paragraph. He says that a nil consciousness is a true nothing, while a nullified consciousness is really the result of the fact that we are dealing with two opposite forces that are canceling each other out. When we remove one of these forces, the force holding in check, then the force reveals itself, right? If you put a stone on a string and it's just sitting there, there is a what Leibniz calls a virtual force that it is realized as soon as we cut the string, and it manifests itself. The plant holds itself in nullified consciousness. It exerts a force that makes the plant have the shape that it has, and if we removed this force, it would stop having that shape. But it is not expressing actively this force in movement. He says that when we mechanically accomplish a habitual action, or when the sleepwalker mechanically acts out of the dream, unconsciousness might well be absolute. But this time it is the result of how the representation of the act is held in check by the execution of the act itself. This execution, being so perfectly similar to the representation and inserting itself so precisely into it that no consciousness can overflow the action any longer. And here comes the italic part. The representation is blocked by the action. That this is indeed intended to be one of the propositions describing the essence of intelligence is clear from the way that he follows this passage. Here, I will continue reading it. What he says is, the proof is that if the accomplishment of the act is stopped or impeded by an obstacle, consciousness can spring forth. So the fact that he gives a proof already kind of lets on that this is one of the propositions, that this is meant to be proved geometrically, right? In the geometrical method, you give a proposition and then you provide a proof of it. So this proof is actually really important and is really only expressed clearly in his text, The Soul and the Body, in the book Mind Energy. So this is a perfect time to turn to that text now, and I'm going to read a passage of it. And it really focuses on this line right here. Consciousness was there, but was neutralized by the action that filled up the representation. That consciousness is impeded by an obstacle, but it can spring forth from being stopped. On page 43 of Mind Energy, he says, the idea is a halt of thought. It arises when the thinking, instead of continuing on its train, makes a pause or is reflected back on itself. It is like the heat that produces itself in the projectile which encounters an obstacle. But it was no more a part of our thought whilst we were thinking than the heat was to be found in the projectile before the stop. So the reality of thought is this movement, and of course this movement, when the projectile hits a obstacle, it heats up. And that's a manifestation of that inner movement now that it has halted. So thought must be understood to have this duplicity to it as well. That it has its integral moving reality, and then it has its derivative reality that is its interruption. Intellect is the interruption of the intuitive movement, sense-making movement of life. So Bergson takes this example of the projectile heating up and he goes one level deeper with it in order to get at the exact same description, to describe the exact same phenomena of the emergence of intellect from a halt. So he says, try, for example, by piecing together the ideas heat, production, and projectile, and intercalating the ideas, inwardness and reflection, expressed in the words in and itself. And you will reconstitute the thought I just expressed in the sentence, heat produces itself in the projectile. So he's asking us to reflect on this. Do this for yourself. Think about each of these things: production, projectile, and then inwardness and reflection, in order to think the heat that is produced in the projectile. He goes on and says, you will see that it is impossible that the thought translated by the sentence is an indivisible movement, and that the ideas corresponding to each of the words are simply the images or concepts which would arise if the mind, at each moment of the thinking, if the thinking halted, would produce. But it does not halt. So, he continues, put aside then artificial reconstructions of thinking. Consider thinking itself. You will find directions rather than states. You will see that thinking is essentially a continual and continuous change of inward direction, incessantly tending to translate itself into changes of outward direction. I mean, by actions and gestures capable of outlining in space and of expressing metaphorically, as it were, the comings and goings of the mind. I'm going to pause here and just note that when Bergson here talks about changes of inward direction, we can think here of a curving movement which has tendency. It's not just a change, which would be moving in a straight line, but curving is a change of a change. It's a change applied to a change, so that it is changing a change, which is what Bergson defines a tendency as. Now, these incessant changes of direction, the word direction needs to be connected with the word sense. In fact, sense and direction are synonymous in French, while sense also means meaning and sensible quality, right? And movement here is a gesture. It is a movement endowed with meaning, or a movement that engenders meaning. So thinking is this tension between the meaning of movement and the accomplishment of movement, and the renegotiation of the direction based on the continual experience of concrete movements. So essentially, there are a vast multiplicity of movements in the body, in our imagination, in our sensory motor system that accompany all of our thinking, and that sketch out and prepare our thinking to go in different directions. And we are not always aware of these, in the same way that we aren't aware of all that it takes to organize our breath pattern and the shape of our mouth when we're speaking, right? We focus on the ideas that we're saying, and we have to take it for granted that all of the habits of our speaking and listening to ourselves speak and all of that works accurately throughout that process. And we only become aware of these underlying sort of habits of movement when we try to understand thought. And when we try to grasp thought as living and make it pass, still living, he says, into the soul of another. When we attempt to translate our lived experience and the inner life of knowing, right? Not the halted form. So we encounter that very problem in our effort to grasp our inner life in its living activity and to pass it to another. And continuing on page 44 of Mind Energy, Bergson writes, the words may, then, have been well chosen. They will not convey the whole of what we wish to make them say if we do not succeed by the rhythm. Okay, I'm obviously messing this up on purpose to make a point. The words may then have been well chosen. They will not convey the whole of what we wish to make them say if they do not succeed by the rhythm, by the punctuation, by the relative lengths of the sentences and the parts of the sentences, by a particular dancing of the sentence, in making the reader's mind, continually guided by a series of nascent movements, describe a thought, a curve of thought, a feeling analogous to what we ourselves describe. In this consists the whole art of writing. It is somewhat like the art of the musician. but do not believe that such music is simply addressed to the ear, as usually is supposed. A foreigner, however trained their ear may be to music, will not recognize the difference between prose that we find musical and that which is not, between what is perfectly written in our language and what is only approximately so. Evident proof that we are dealing with something quite other than musical harmony of sound. The truth is that the writer's art consists above everything in making us forget that he is using words. The harmony he seeks is a certain correspondence between the comings and goings of his mind and the phrasing of his speech, a correspondence so perfect that the waves of his thought, borne by the sentence, stir us sympathetically, and the words, taken individually, no longer count. There is nothing but the flow of meaning which runs through the words, nothing but two minds without intermediary seem to vibrate directly in unison with one another. The rhythm of speech has, here, then, no object other than the reproduction of the rhythm of thought. And what can the rhythm of thought be but the rhythm of the scarcely conscious nascent movements which accompany it? These movements, which thought continuously tends to externalize into actions, are clearly prepared and, as it were, performed in the brain. It is this motor accompaniment of thought, and not the thought itself, that we should probably perceive if we penetrated into the work of the brain. In other words, thought is directed towards action, and when it does not end in a real action, it sketches out one or several virtual, simply possible actions. These real or virtual actions, which are the diminished and simplified projection of thought in space, and which mark off its motor articulation, are what is outlined of thought in the cerebral substance. The relation of the brain to thought is then complex and subtle. Were you to ask me to express it in a simple formula, necessarily crude, I should say that the brain is an organ of pantomime, and of pantomime only. Its part is to play the life of the mind, and to play also the external situation to which the mind must adapt itself. The work of the brain is to the whole of conscious life what the movement of the conductor's baton is to the orchestra symphony. As the symphony overflows the movements which scan it, so the mental life overflows the cerebral life. But the brain, precisely because it extracts from the mental life whatever it has that may be played in movement, whatever is materializable, precisely because it constitutes thus the point of insertion of the mind in matter, secures at the very moment the adaptation of the mind to circumstances, continually keep the mind in touch with realities. The brain is then, strictly speaking, neither an organ of thought nor feeling of consciousness, but it keeps consciousness, feeling, and thought tensely strained on life, and consequently making them capable of efficacious action. Let us say, if you will, that the brain is the organ of the attention to life. So just as the conductor, has to know the entire score and give it its specific quality and orchestration, the concerted movement that it orchestrates. I don't know, the brain is what habitually conducts the body and all movements in the body and thought and nascent movements towards the needs of life, towards the attention to life. It keeps them blocked out, it keeps them dissociated from what is a distraction, and keeps life's tension by extracting what is most invigorating to the activity of life. The activity of life feeds on the attention to life and keeps us devoted to our attention to life. And as we'll see, that means that we remain canalized in intellect and dissociate from the virtual and from everything that goes beyond what is representable, and thus we don't understand life, think only in terms of intelligence. So continuing now with Creative Evolution on page 132, Bergson says, consciousness is the light immanent to the zone of possible actions, or virtual activity, that surrounds the action actually being accomplished by the living being. Consciousness means hesitation or choice, where many equal possible actions are sketched out without any real action being accomplished, such as in an ongoing deliberation. Consciousness is intense, where the real action is the only action possible, such as in activities like sleepwalking or more generally, automatic ones. consciousness becomes nil. From this point of view, we could define the consciousness of the living being as an arithmetical difference between the virtual activity and the real activity. Consciousness measures the gap between representation and action. So basically, again, representations emerge when something is preventing the action from happening. So if we don't prevent the action from happening, like in sleepwalking, there's no representation because it's swallowed by the action. Now, if the action is not occurring, then there's a representation. And the representation, beyond the representation, there is the virtual activity, which is activities that are held in check by a contrary activity, right? Like as in the case of plant life. Now, the arithmetical difference that he speaks of between virtual activity and real activity, what this means is that real activity is subtracted from virtual activity. The remainder will be consciousness. Consciousness measures the gap when we subtract the real from the virtual. And real is maybe not the best word here, but the actual from the virtual, from the action from the representation. Bergson then moves on to compare instinct a little bit further with intellect, stating that intellect is more geared towards consciousness, while instinct is more geared towards unconsciousness. Instinct is much like sleepwalking. It eliminates the representation and loses itself in the action. And he says when consciousness does appear, it illuminates less the instinct itself than those frustrations to which the intellect is subjected. It is the deficit of the intellect, the distance from the act to the idea, that becomes consciousness. As a result, consciousness will be merely an accident. In essence, consciousness will only emphasize the instinct's initial step, the one that released the entire series of automatic movements. To the contrary, when it becomes the intellect, deficit is its normal state. Its very essence is to be subjected to frustrations. Given that its primary function is to fabricate inorganic instruments, the intellect must choose, in the face of 1,000 difficulties, the time and the place, the form and the matter for its work. And it will never be entirely satisfied, because every new satisfaction creates a new need. In short, although instinct and intellect both involve knowledge, in the case of instinct, knowledge is enacted or played and unconscious. In the case of the intellect, knowledge is thought and conscious. But this is more a difference of degree than of nature. So long as we only focus on consciousness, we will fail to see what, from a psychological point of view, is the main difference between intellect and instinct. That was on page 133, 146 in the French. So instinct and intellect are, in a way, different in degree of consciousness. There is a lower degree of consciousness in instinct and a greater degree of consciousness in intellect. Although, as we're going to see, that is, first of all, not enough to define the difference between the two, but also it isn't very accurate, because intellect, as we're going to see, while it does, we could say, participate more in consciousness, it is just as prone to its own forms of torpidity, as we'll get to moving forward. So Bergson now goes on to enumerate differences between intellect and instinct, and to uncover other essential qualities of it in his italicized propositions, which I will continue to read now. Thus, let us say that if we consider what instinct and intellect contain in terms of innate knowledge, we find that, in the first case, this innate knowledge bears upon things, and in the second, upon relations. That was page 135, 149 in the French, and then a little bit further down on the same page, he says, I will give the distinction between the intellect and instinct the following more precise formulation. The intellect, in terms of what it has that is innate, is the knowledge of a form, whereas instinct involves knowledge of a matter. So here Bergson is following some classical philosophical distinctions. We see here a hylomorphism, a matter-form relation, although this isn't technically a hylomorphism because the one is going for form and the other is going for matter. So there are two forms of knowledge, one which goes for each side of the hylomorphism. Now, it's important to know here that matter doesn't mean what he normally means by matter, so the matter as the spatialized representation, the derivative form of thought about physical things. But what he really means here is the concrete movements with their qualitative multiplicity, the animals themselves, their living bodies, and the whole of nature in its qualitative richness. That is what instinct knows. It knows qualitative movement and the inner movement of things. It actually knows matter as the duration of life, as a kind of rhythm. And form here means something somewhat, you might say, early modern. It relates to ideas in Descartes and Spinoza and Leibniz about form. Space is the form of the mind in its intellectual function. This is actually very Kantian as well. The form of knowledge is the way in which we make sense of it with logic and with relations between things, right? So he goes from the first proposition here that innate knowledge of the instinct bears upon things, or upon living things, we should say, and in the second, upon relations. And relations are what is common to things, what is general. Here, Spinoza has the notion of common notions taken from Euclid. Common notions are things that apply anywhere in geometry. That if I take a line and I superimpose it on another line and they're the same length, then those lines are equal. Well, that also applies to a circle and to a triangle and to many other things, right? There's a kind of common notion about the way that equal things in geometry can be superimposed over top of each other. So by form here, he really means geometrical form, and he means the way that the general characteristics of things that do not touch their essence, do not touch their concrete particularity, which would be their matter in this case, because the matter in this case is the duration of life itself. And so from these new definitions on page 138, 152 in the French, he draws a new distinction between intellect and instinct. And here's what he says. The difference between instinct and intellect that I will here indicate is the very one that my entire analysis thus far has tended to bring out. I would formulate it as follows. There are things that the intellect alone is capable of looking for, but will never find by itself. Instinct alone could find these things, but it will never go looking for them. What he means is that the intellect is completely turned in a specific way of looking at things. It looks at the general, it looks at the common notions, it analyzes things by halting them, by projecting them into space, by turning them into something finite. So it will never find them because it doesn't have the tools to find them. Now, instinct, on the other hand, does have the tools, we could say, to find these things, and that is because it has an innate knowledge of life, and that it is geared into life, and that it sees things in an organic way, in a kind of vital sense. Now, it will never actually go looking for them because it is completely beholden to the attention to life, to the needs of life, and to the concrete particularities of the situations in which it encounters other life forms. Again, instinct is locked into its dissociative specialization, and so is intellect, right? They're both locked in their own dissociative directions, and it is only by reintegrating them in a certain way that we can unlock what he calls intuition. And it will be when, because of the intellect, we move back to instinct, but back to instinct in a completely new way that is a sort of disassociated instinct in which we connect to the movement of life intuitively. Next proposition is on page 139, 154 in the French, and I'll read the paragraph leading up to it because it really helps a lot. Let us begin from action and posit that in principle, the intellect aims first and foremost at fabricating. Fabrication works exclusively upon brute matter, in the sense that even if it employs organic materials, it treats them like inert objects, not worrying about the life that has given them their form. Fabrication retains of brute matter hardly anything other than what is solid. The rest slips away by its very fluidity. Thus, if the intellect tends towards fabricating, then we can predict that whatever is fluid in the real will partially escape it, and whatever is properly vital in the living being will entirely escape it. Okay, now here comes the proposition in italics. Our intellect, such as it emerges from the hands of nature, takes the inorganic solid as its principal object. Now he goes on to show us what the nature of the inorganic solid is, and on page 140 he says, "The discontinuous is the only thing the intellect conceives clearly." And on the very next page, "Immobility is the only thing our intellect conceives of clearly." And a bit further down on the same page, "Now, fabricating consists in cutting the form of an object out of a material. The most important thing of all is the form to be obtained. In terms of the matter, the most convenient one is chosen." And on the next page again, he says, "The whole of matter will thus necessarily appear to our thought as an immense fabric from which we can cut out what we like, so that we can sew it together again as we please." Okay, so by immobilizing and by cutting out and by making discontinuous the continuity and interpenetration of things within the sensible world that we experience, we are able to interrupt matter and insert our own future into it. We are able to see this fabric of interrelations, and only what is common to them and what is repeatable and what we can reliably do to cut out certain parts and sew them together as we please, and to thus orchestrate our world and control the different forces that we encounter. Knowledge of the matter in fabrication is the knowledge of, if you're going to make an axe, that you need to have copper or iron or what have you, right? So this is a concrete sense of the knowledge of matter, but one in which the intellect is, selecting what is useful and manipulating matter in order to compose it in a way that is most useful. So a little further down the page, he says, "Let it suffice to say that the intellect is characterized by its indefinite power for decomposing according to any law whatsoever, and of recomposing into whatever system whatsoever." Now, what he means by this proposition is clear by what he says right before it. He says, "What is perceived is extension, insofar as it is colored, resistant, and divided up according to the lines that sketch out the contours of real bodies, or of their real elementary parts. But when we conceive of our power over this matter, that is, of our faculty for decomposing and recomposing it as we please, we project behind real extension, and in block, all of the possible decompositions and recompositions in the form of a homogeneous, empty, and indifferent space that subtends it. This space is thus, above all, the schema of our possible action upon things, even if things have a natural tendency, as I will explain below, to enter into a schema of this kind. It is a view adopted by the mind. The animal probably has no idea of space, even when, like us, it perceives extended things. Space is a representation that symbolizes the human intellect's tendency towards fabrication. So that is why it is characterized, the human intellect is characterized by the indefinite power for decomposing according to any law whatsoever and recomposing into any system whatsoever. And this is made evident in geometry. There's a certain set of laws, and from these, an entire system of geometry is produced. This describes a kind of mobility of the intellect, and its composing and recomposing. This is very similar to the activity of habit. So this points to both a creative and active form of habit and intellect, what we might call the mobility of the intellect as it is creative and expressive. So this is expressed in the sensory motor system as well as in language, and it's the analysis of language that really draws out this account. So on page 142, he says, I have enumerated some of the essential traits of human intellect, but I have considered the individual in an isolated state without taking social life into account. In reality, man is a being who lives in society. And then on page 143, language makes collective action possible. So language emerges from its practical use in our social life. And a little further down the page, he says, there must be a language that allows us at any given moment to go from what we know to what we do not know. There must be a language whose signs, which cannot be indefinite in number, can nevertheless be extended to an infinity of things. Anything can designate anything else. Such is the latent principle of childhood language. And a bit further down the page, he says, animals themselves generalize, and indeed a sign, even if it is an instinctive one, always more or less represents a genus. What characterizes the signs of human language is less their generality than their mobility. The instinctive sign is adherent, the intelligent sign is mobile. The mobility of words is what Bergson is looking at here. And the mobility of words allows for a continuous growth of thought, but it also gives us the entire problem of halting thought. He says, of course, language could not have given the faculty of reflection to the intellect that was entirely externalized and incapable of folding back upon itself. An intellect that reflects is an intellect that had a surplus of force to spend beyond its practically useful efforts. This is a consciousness that had already virtually won back control of itself, but it's still necessary for this virtuality to become actual. Presumably, without language, the intellect would have remained riveted to the material objects that it had some interest in considering. It would have lived in a state of somnambulance, sleepwalking, living outside itself and hypnotized by its work. Language greatly contributed to liberating it. The word, designed to go from one thing to another, is in effect essentially transferable and free. As such, it can be extended not only to from one perceived thing to another, but also from the perceived thing to the memory of this thing, from the precise memory to a more fleeting image, and from a fleeting but nevertheless still represented image to the representation of the act by which one represents it, that is, to the idea. In this way, the intellect, which had been looking to the outside, would suddenly find before its eyes a whole inner world, namely, the spectacle of its own operations. Moreover, the intellect was merely waiting for this opportunity. It made use of the fact that the word itself is a thing that, in order to penetrate, being carried along by the word, into the interior of its own work. As much as its first vocation was to fabricate instruments, this fabrication is only possible through the use of certain means, and that are not precisely tailored to their object, but that go beyond it, and that thereby allow the intellect to undertake a supplementary work, namely the one of disinterestedness. From the day that the intellect, reflecting upon its own procedure, perceived itself as the creator of ideas, as the faculty of representation in general, there was no longer any object it did not want to have an idea of, even if that object was lacking any direct relation to practical action. This is why I said that there are things the intellect alone can look for, that it is the intellect that is concerned with these sorts of theories, and its theory wants to embrace everything, not only brute matter, upon which it has a natural hold, but also life and thought. Okay, I'm not going to read all of this, but on the next page, 145, he says, because the word is mobile, because it makes its way from one thing to the next, the intellect, at some point, had to take hold of it along the way, even though it had not come to rest upon anything. He's saying take hold of the word, in order to apply it to an object that is not a thing, and that, having been hidden until then, was waiting for the safety of the word before coming out of the shadow into the light. Of course, here he's talking about the intellect itself, its activity, what it finds when it becomes disinterested, and does a sort of phenomenology of the intellect when it reflects on its own pattern of action. But it takes that inner experience, that phenomenological reality, and it puts words to it. And so he says, continuing exactly where I was reading, by covering this object, of course, the intellect, the soul, the word converts it again into a thing. In this way, even when the intellect is no longer operating upon brute matter, it still follows the habits that it contracted from that operation. It applies the very same forms it used in inorganic matter to itself and to understanding its life. The intellect is only shaped and only empowered at the genesis of our philosophical life. When we begin philosophizing, our intellect is shaped entirely by this contracted habit of dealing with inorganic matter in order to make work easier. This type of work, he says, is the only one that fully satisfies the intellect, and that is what it expresses when it claims that this type of work is the only way to arrive at distinctness and clarity. When the intellect tries to understand itself, it's only satisfied with using tools and a certain language, certain commitments that are incapable of performing the task that it sets out for itself. So, intellect is both an integral cause and an impediment to our intuitive knowledge of life and of the mind, and the knowledge that the intellect can have of itself. No matter what else it does, it always reduces the organic to the inorganic, because without revising its natural direction and without twisting back upon itself, the intellect is unable to think true continuity, real mobility, reciprocal interpenetration. In sum, it is unable to think that creative evolution that is life itself. That was page 146, and now here on 147 he says, the truth is that this continuity cannot be thought by an intellect that gives itself over to its own natural movement. This continuity involves both the multiplicity of elements and the reciprocal penetration of them all together. Two properties that can hardly be reconciled in the field where industriousness and thereby intellect operates. And on the very next page he says, for our understanding, the finality par excellence is the one we find in our industriousness, whereby we work according to a model that is given in advance. That is to say, one that is old and that is composed of known elements. As the invention properly so called, which is nevertheless the starting point of industriousness itself, our intellect is not able to grasp it in its springing forth, that is, insofar as it is indivisible, nor in its genius, that is, insofar as it is creative. Explaining invention always consists in reducing what was unforeseeable and new into known or old elements arranged in a different order. The intellect no more admits complete novelty than it does radical becoming. So it's almost as if there are two forms of industriousness here. There's industriousness that is on the model of manufacturing, and then there's behind that a creativity and life and intellect in its mobility springing forth in a creative act, right? And this is what invention really consists of. It really consists of something that the intellect itself can't really understand, because invention is radical becoming and introduces new meaning into the universe. And the scientist, as a reductionist and as a materialist, can't have meaning in the universe at all. So they can't explain the radical introduction of novelty and new meaning into a world, because that new meaning is woven into a fabric of already existing meaning that science and the intellect cannot understand, because everything is general. Everything is what is common between things. Everything is the divisible halt and what can be generalized in things and frozen, rather than the pouring forth of novelty. So on page 149, he gives the final proposition in his series of propositions on the essence of the intellect, and says, "The intellect is characterized by a natural incomprehension of life." And I would say that this really has been proven at this point using the intellect itself. He's given us these formulas, he's explained them, he's filled them out with the phenomenal content of our own intellects and our own life, and shown us the self-evidence of these facts about action, about the way that action fabricates, about the way that the intellect cuts off and distracts itself, and that it's all about the general and not about the unique individual or the matter of things. And thus, it misses the phenomenon of life, the reciprocal implication that meaningfulness has within life, and that life experiences a kind of psychological state that cannot be put into words, and that the intellect cannot even understand its own life, its own living activity, without converting it into a schema, something dead, something that really cannot comprehend life. So Bergson drops this geometrical appearing method where he's giving us definitions of an essence, and moves on to sympathy, and he uses his own method here, his method of, on the one hand, tarrying with science, and on the other hand, drawing on the experiments of his own internal experience as a living being. And I should say that tarrying with science means, on the one hand, kind of like running alongside it and having comradeship with it, but it also means delaying it and slowing it down, and in a way, delaying it from jumping to the conclusions of materialism. What metaphysical intuition needs to do is to linger there and hesitate within science, within the evidence that science brings forward, within the scientific accounts themselves, and also to allow there to be a hesitation that opens a new sense-making movement, a new comprehension of things through intuition, through our sympathy with the psychological nature of everything, the universe itself, of matter, of life, in its various tendencies as plant and animal. On page 159, he says, "Instinct is sympathy. If this sympathy could spread out its object and also reflect upon itself, it would give us the key to vital operations, just as the intellect, fully developed and properly disciplined, introduces us into matter. For, and I cannot repeat this enough, intellect and instinct are turned in two opposite directions, the former towards inert matter and the latter toward life. The intellect, through the intermediary of science, which is its own creation, delivers the secret of the physical operations to us more and more completely. When it comes to life, it only provides us with a translation of life into the language of the inert, and indeed does not claim to provide us with anything more. It circles all around it, and adopting as many external viewpoints as possible, draws this object towards itself rather than entering into it." but intuition, by which I mean instinct that has become disinterested, self-conscious, and capable of reflecting upon and indefinitely enlarging its object, takes us to the very interior of life. And now I'll read another passage from 160. The intellect remains the illuminated core around which instinct, even when enlarged to and refined into intuition, forms but a vague nebulosity. But in the absence of knowledge properly so called, which is reserved of pure intellect alone, intuition will be able to help us grasp what is insufficiently here in the givens of the intellect and allow us to catch sight of the means of completing them. On the one hand, intuition will make use of the very mechanism of the intellect to show how the intellectual framework no longer find their precise application here. And on the other hand, through its own work, intuition will suggest at the very least a vague feeling of what must replace these intellectual frameworks. In this way, intuition will be able to bring the intellect to recognize that life fully enters neither into the category of the many nor into that of the one, and that neither mechanical causality nor finality offer a sufficient translation of the vital process. Then, through the sympathetic communication that it will establish between us and the rest of living beings, through the dilation that it will obtain in our consciousness, intuition will introduce us into the domain of life itself, which is reciprocal interpenetration and indefinitely continuous creation. But if intuition goes beyond intellect in this way, the intellect will have been the source of the disturbance that made it rise up to the place it has reached. Without the intellect, intuition would have remained in the form of instinct, riveted to the specific object that interests it practically, and thereby externalized by that object into movements of locomotion. So because the intellect and its favorite tool, language, are unsuited to understanding life, there is another way open to us beyond the mechanical and the final and the one and the many and all of these concepts. Instead, what we can do is form a sympathetic communication that establishes us and the rest of living beings through a dilation that will obtain in our consciousness. Intuition introduces us into the domain of life itself, right? Life as psychological, as this reciprocal interpenetration of the virtual and the indefinite, continuous creation that consciousness accomplishes by linking the virtual and the actual in an ongoing creative adaptation. And he also said a little earlier in the passage that it is the job of intuition to first follow the intellect and use its own tools to criticize it and show the limits of it. And he does this already here through the understanding of language as the tool that the intellect uses in order to free itself from the attention to life, but also gives itself a new system to become asleep in, whether that's systems of symbols or of quantities or the symbols and quantities that make up the materialist worldview. In the next chapter, he's going to describe this as the cinematographical mechanism. It is looking at the intellect as a snapshot, a series of snapshots like a camera, and a cinematographical mechanism is the projector, which replays them by rapidly playing them. Frame rates of 18 or so is as little as you can possibly do and have it still work, but usually 24 or 30, and today 60 and 120 and things like that. But the intellect conceives of perception as this series of representations like the frames in the projector, but there aren't actually any individual frames. There's a continuity of experience. And we can't simply just say that there are an infinite number of infinitely thin frames. I mean, it's clear in any kind of, intentional movement. If we get up and walk, it's the fluidity of that, an indivisible act and an indivisible connection between diverse movements, like when we turn a doorknob. There's the gripping movement and the twisting movement, and those two movements act indivisibly together in the same way that the body coordinates itself when we walk. It's really the unity of the gesture and its ability to make meaning through its movement that is the basis of our creativity. And we see this connecting the sensory motor system and language and the body in general, that they all have this mobility to them. They're not just the habituated repetition of something, of like the entelechy that shapes them or something like that. No, but in the sensory motor system, the motor habits can hold each other in check and allow for a hesitation in which greater and greater degree of memory and modulation of our perspective can come into play. And likewise, in language, we can create a multiplicity of images that cancel each other out, and in their canceling of each other out, allow for a new thought to grasp them all as an intuition. So, summing up the intuitive sense of life and the way that intuition and intellect function within it, on page 163, he says, "The evolution of life, examined from this angle, takes on a clearer meaning, even if it cannot be subsumed under a genuine idea. Everything takes place as if a vast current of consciousness had penetrated into matter, bearing with it, like every consciousness, an enormous multiplicity of interpenetrating virtualities. This current drew matter into organic development, but as a result, the movement of this current was infinitely slowed down and infinitely divided up. Indeed, on the one hand, this consciousness had to fall asleep, like the chrysalis in the cocoon where it develops its wings. And on the other hand, the multiple tendencies it contained were shared out among the diverging series of organisms that, for that matter, externalized these tendencies into movements rather than internalize them into representations. During the course of this evolution, while some fell more and more deeply into sleep, others awakened more and more fully, and the torpor of the former organisms aided the activity of the latter ones. But this awakening was able to take place in two different ways. Life, that is, consciousness, launched through matter, fixed its attention either on its own movement or on the matter it was passing through. In this way, it oriented itself either in the direction of intuition or in the direction of the intellect. At first glance, intuition seems much preferable to intellect, since life and consciousness remain within each other. But the spectacle of the evolution of living beings shows that intuition could not go very far. On the side of intuition, consciousness found itself compressed to such a point by its envelope that it had to contract intuition down into an instinct. That is, to embrace only that tiny portion of life that interested it. And indeed, only embracing in the dark, touching it with hardly even seeing it. From this side, the horizon was immediately closed off. To the contrary, consciousness establishing itself as intellect, that is, focusing first on matter, seemed in this way to externalize itself in relation to itself. But precisely because it is adapted to external objects, it is able to circulate among them, to get around the barriers that it can encounter, and to increase its domain indefinitely. Moreover, once liberated, it can fold back within itself and reawaken the virtualities of intuition that lie dormant within it. So what that means is that consciousness is inherently intuitive, or it's primordially intuitive, but due to the restraints of matter and the situations of life, it has had to settle for a instinctual rather than an intuitive knowing. It has had to shrink down the intuition into instinct, which means that it is very narrow and very specific. And oftentimes, it's about the exact day that the turtle needs to go climb on the beach and have its babies and everything. And if it doesn't get it to the exact day, then it won't work. And there's many examples of this across nature, of such specific knowledge about how to do exactly one thing. And so the intuition is actually something virtually in us as a kind of memory, a memory of a way of thinking that is creative and is a sort of non-specific knowledge of life, a kind of sympathetic, non-specific power of knowing life and acting and living. And here's the passage I mentioned a few minutes ago on page 165, where the freedom emerging in motor habit is seen to be similar to the one in language, and both are essential to intuition in some sense. It is consciousness surpassing the enthrallment or the succumbing always to their mechanical function, to the pre-established motor habits, to the conventions of language, to the generalities of language. But rather we see the sensory motor system and language in their mobility being creative and connecting things and experimenting. And now any word can be put with any word. This is the power we have to create new words. It's the embryonic process of creatively advancing and changing the meaning by applying words in new ways. And it's of course clear that not anything means anything is effective in communication and making sense of things. And when we use metaphor to make something make sense in a new way that we've never thought before, and to not just think one thing isomorphically with another, but to have a complex structure of difference and comparison. So through metaphors, we can gather a whole bunch of memories and ideas and explanations and all of that. And he's going to do this again and again in the next chapter, putting everything he's said together in a new framing, giving it certain metaphorical images. So here's what he says on 165. For the animal, the motor mechanisms that the brain is able to set up, or in other words, the habits that its will contracts, have no other objective and no other effect than to accomplish the movements that are sketched out in these habits or stored up in these mechanisms. But in humans, the motor habits can have a second result, one that is incommensurate with the first. One motor habit can hold other motor habits in check, and, by thus taking control of the mechanical functioning, the automatisms, free consciousness. We know that language occupies vast territories of the human brain, and cerebral mechanisms that correspond to words have the particularity that they can be geared into other mechanisms, those, for example, that correspond to the things themselves, or again, be geared into each other. During this time, consciousness, which would have otherwise been carried off and submerged in the accomplishment of the act, takes hold of itself and frees itself. In the next chapter, he's going to say that the mind is always ordering everything as a whole. The body and its life and the mind together organize our lived experience as a duration. This activity is a turn of a kaleidoscope. It is a focusing and shifting of our consciousness, of our planes of consciousness, of our dissociations, of our disintegrations and reintegrations. Bergson again here talks about a re-gearing of the brain, where the plasticity opens to a multiplicity of reciprocal implication. Once we experience a vast multiplicity of possible sensory motor responses, humans and animals in general have a vast number of sensory motor responses at any time. Now, of course, for animals, there's more instinct, and for humans, it's more plastic. But it's not entirely plastic. It just has its peculiarities and its limits that it can push beyond. We can only have the habits of what is afforded in the world. So we can form new habits and we can find new habits, but only in conjunction with the affordances of our life and the world and our contexts. But when we look at the intellect as this infinitely powerful thing to make arbitrary connections, and the fecundity of language and the sensory motor system to create new meaning, we see intuition expressing itself across the different aspects of human life. Anytime the intellect is folding back upon itself, as he says many times in the chapter, such as on page 143, 146, 164, 210, and 220. And we also saw it in the body and soul in the body from Mind Energy. The twisting of the intellect and folding back upon itself, this always involves a little bit of intuition. And so while philosophical intuition methodologically pursues these moments and is capable of developing them, despite that, there are these moments of intellect folding back upon itself and twisting on itself and creating integral knowledge in everyday life. In a way, we could think knowledge that we have of ourselves by living it and by a certain know-how of life, an implicit or operative knowledge of things. And in this way, we sympathize with the movement of life and with each other. And ultimately, we have a instinctive, intuitive sense of the élan vital, of this vital, hesitant impetus, right? It's an impetus that is also slowing itself down. It's a cautious movement, like a cat that hesitates before its jump. Intuitions make their leap hesitantly, and in the interval of their hesitation, they modulate consciousness. They integrate a multiplicity of new thoughts and memories, and all of those thoughts and memories put together in a multiplicity of different ways, complicating the implicate order of the virtual. So this folding back, this twisting in and on itself, we can think of as a metaphor for the implicate complication of an infinite multiplicity. That infinite multiplicity can be twisted and folded back on itself and made to produce an infinite number of repetitions of itself that are different. Just as our personality is an infinity of perspectives on itself, and it is the very destabilizing effect of that multiplicity. That is what a personality is, and it divides and it activates through this individuating process that cuts off certain possibilities and selects. Every decision pushes a certain path further, and they accumulate, and there's a certain inertia created by all of our decisions that shapes the multiplicity. And when we cut off certain potentials, they don't stop being part of our personality. And Bergson says, he could have been a mathematician, and he actually was very good at mathematics when he was younger, but he decided to study philosophy. And so he, in a way, cut off those possibilities and invested his time other places. And there's way more in our personality than what we can actually be in the world. I mean, of course, there are people that are kind of boring and don't have much personality, but for people with a lot of personality, they want to be more than they are, and they can't be as much as they are. As they are virtually. They cannot actually be as complex and as implicate and nuanced as they are virtually in their actualization. The novelist, according to Bergson, is the person who has the most personality, like way too much personality, to the point that they create all these characters. And all these characters are somehow contained in their virtual self, in the persona, in the personality that they have on an integral virtual level. And of course, we see some people form personality in a much more conventional, conservative sense, and other people have experimental, dynamic, poetic, and expansive ways of expressing personality. Thought is the movement that the mind accomplishes. When we speak about a thought or about a state of the mind or a cognitive process, we are talking about a halt, right? The same way that the bullet that hits an obstacle becomes hot, and we call that heat thought. Thought is rather the movement, and its energy and power are not shot in a single direction. They explode out like a cannonball that explodes in a million directions. And that's true for life, and it's also true for us in different ways. But for life, it goes between plants and animals and humans and all of that. And for us, it is going between divergent tendencies and habits within ourselves. Combining these metaphors, the morphology of life and the morphology of animals, what we study in the fossil record, the phenotypes and the process of embryogenesis and all of that, that's all just the heat in the bullet. That's not the movement itself. The heat is just the realization of the interruption of the movement when it hits an obstacle. Now, in the next chapter, he's going to try to say that consciousness in general is coextensive with a universal form of life, which is the background from which instinct and intellect emerge, and that we need to simultaneously generate both the intellect and matter from a consciousness that envelops them both. Intellectuality and materiality would be constituted in their details through a reciprocal adaptation to one another. So, understanding the genesis of the intellect and the genesis of matter, he's going to undertake these both again, anew, in tandem, as reciprocally adapting to one another. And he actually now provides us with some more propositions about the intellect and italicizes some of these on page 170. The more consciousness is intellectualized, the more matter is spatialized. And with this, he shows that both Spencer and Fichte are wrong, and they have opposite systems that end up doing the same thing, and they're wrong for the same reason. Spencer thinks that the intellect is all of matter, that it is the parallelism of matter and thought. So the perfect interconnectivity of things in the material world can be exactly represented in the intellect, and the intellect is nothing but the absolute correspondence to matter. Now, Fichte, on the other hand, is more philosophical, he says, and more true to the nature of things, but still goes wrong because he concentrates the intellect and boils it down, if you will, to its quintessence and compresses the intellect. And when he does so, he finds that it's coherent with itself, that it produces certain things in a determinate way, that it creates, logic and geometry and things like that. But what he does is then take this concentrated, boiled down and state of the intellect and then dilates it out to reality and basically says that there is a correspondence between reality and this inner structure of consciousness. Now, the way to see the simultaneous genesis of matter and intellect is to return to our lived duration. So on page 178 of chapter 3, he says, "Let us seek in the depths of ourselves the point at which we feel most fully within our own life. We thereby plunge back into pure durée, a duration, where the past that is always on the move continuously swells with the addition of the absolutely new present. But at the same time, we feel the spring of our will being tensed to the extreme limit. Through a violent contraction of our personality upon itself, we must gather together our past, which is slipping away, so as to force it, compacted and undivided, into a present that it will itself create by being introduced into it. Rare are the moments in which we recover possession of ourselves to this extent. These moments are none other than our true free actions. And even then, we can't entirely take hold of ourselves. Our feeling of durée, that is, the coinciding of myself with itself, admits of degrees. But the deeper the feeling and the more complete the coinciding, the more the life it places us back into reabsorbs intellectuality. And going beyond it, since the essential function of the intellect is to link together the same with the same, only facts that can be repeated are entirely adapted to the framework of the intellect. Now, the intellect probably gets, après coup, some hold on the real movement of real durée by reconstituting the new state from a series of views or snapshots taken on it from the outside, and that resemble as much as possible what is already known. In this sense, the state contains intellectually as a potentiality, so to speak, and yet the state, being indivisible and new, overflows and remains incomprehensible with that series of nows. What this means is that the intellect cannot predict what's coming, and when novelty comes into existence, it's true that there is latent intellectuality or latent intelligibility in what comes to be, but it is not the case that the intellect actually can understand it in the tools that it already has. The indivisible and new overflow and remain incomprehensible with the series of prior views. So it's through durée that Bergson understands personality, and I will just leave you with one last passage from page 180, which connects these things and connects to the themes we've talked about throughout this lecture. The more we become conscious of our progression in pure durée, the more we sense the various parts of our being interpenetrate and our entire personality becoming concentrated in a point. Or better, in the sharp edge or tip that inserts itself into the future by continuously cutting into it. This is what free life and free action consists in. But instead, suppose we let ourselves go. Rather than acting, suppose we dream. Our myself is suddenly broken into pieces. Our past, which until then had gathered itself together in the indivisible impulse that it communicated to us, decomposes into thousands and thousands of memories that become external to each other. They refuse to interpenetrate to the extent that they become increasingly fixed. In this way, our personality descends again in the direction of space. Moreover, it constantly mingles with space through sensation. But I will not insist here upon a point that I've developed elsewhere in depth. Let me simply recall that extension admits of degrees, that every sensation is extensive to some degree, and that the idea of unextended sensations, artificially localized in space, is merely a viewpoint adopted by the mind, that is suggested much more by an unconscious metaphysics than by a psychological observation. Of course, even when we let ourselves relax as much as we can, we merely take the first step in the direction of the extended. But imagine for a moment that matter consists in this very movement, just pushed even further, and that physical reality is simply the inverted psychical reality. We would then understand why the mind feels so at ease and moves about so naturally in space from the moment that matter suggests to the mind a more distinct representation of space. The mind already had an implicit representation of space in the very feeling that it gained of its own potential relaxation, that is, of its own extension. The mind rediscovers this space among the things, but it could have obtained it without them if imagination had been powerful enough and pushed the inversion of its own natural movement to the end. On the other hand, we would thus be able to understand why matter further accentuates its materiality under the gaze of the mind. Matter started by helping the mind redescend its own decline. It provided the impulse. But once it had been launched, the mind continues along. The mind's representation of pure space is merely the schema of the points where this movement will have come to an end. Once the mind possesses the form of space, it uses it like a net, whose meshes can be made and unmade at will. A net that, when thrown across matter, divides it up according to the needs of our action. As such, the space of our geometry and the spatiality of things are mutually engendered by the reciprocal action and the reaction of two terms of the same essence that march in opposite directions. Space is not foreign to our nature, as foreign as we imagine, and matter is not as completely extended in space as our intellect and our senses represent it. Bergson summarizes this into a proposition on page 184 in italics. He says, this adaptation between the intellect and matter in their genesis would be accomplished quite naturally because it is the same inversion of the same movement that creates both intellectuality of the mind and the materiality of things. So, as we'll see in chapter 3, the genesis of the mind and the genesis of matter are both like the heat in the bullet, right? They come about through the interruption of the movement that produces them. And what we study is not really them, it's this secondary effect of them.